joined at the Longevity Leaders Conference for a discussion on capturing the value of an experienced workforce. The panel comprised Andy Briggs of Phoenix Group, Lesley Johnson of the BBC, Placid of Unilever, and myself, Amy Richards with Mercer. The panel strongly highlighted the competitive advantage which an inclusive workforce incorporating older workers can bring. The talent pipeline is thinning and the experience and capacity of older workers is critical. I'd like to take a couple of minutes here to recap the most interesting takeaways from the discussion for you. Placid set the tone, emphasising why capturing the value of your experienced workforce is so important. To use his words, if work works, the world works. When the world of work is broken, we suffer a lot as a society. We went on to discuss the differing expectations and experiences of planning retirement and later life across the multi-generational workforce which we are faced with today. Andy set out for us 3 important generational pools: the younger generation in pensions with auto-enrolment type structures in many countries, the older generations with good DB pensions, and really crucially the lost middle who've fallen between those two. This really highlighted 3 completely different financial wellbeing challenges which have to be navigated. We also talked about the differing segments of the workforce: those that want to work and can't, those that want to work and can, those that have to work but can't, and those that have to work and can. Different solutions are needed for each group, with of course those in work being relatively easier for employers to engage and make a difference for. Some interesting points on the enablers of keeping an engaged older workforce were also raised. These included thoughtful policies. Sometimes these policies are there, but not necessarily crafted through the eyes of the generations that need them. For example, carers policies, which may be more focused on the younger generation, but are actually as, if not more important for the older generation. In some cases, some of these policies don't even exist as yet in many organisations, such as menopause policies. Flexible working was also discussed as a tool to help more people stay in the workforce. Communication is a key piece of the puzzle, and the panel highlighted that we can't make broad brush assumptions about people's wants and needs. Data and open lines of communication to connect with your people are critical. Additionally, we had a great conversation about pushing forwards an age diversity agenda. The panel stressed the need to open our diversity lens to age. The benefits of diversity are now clear. Inclusive and diverse businesses make better decisions from a broader range of perspectives and better represent their customer bases and communities. Lesley shared the experiences she's had at the BBC of representing older workers. Age is a universal factor. As she said, if we're lucky enough, we'll all end up old. Anything we can do to serve the older generation really benefits others. Some tools that the group found are working well include financial education that starts early, and also using data to identify what problems are real and what are really urban myths, such as older workers' exposure to redundancy. The panel set out a couple of really interesting models on how to live, learn, work and earn differently, which their companies are trialling. The first one we heard about was a midlife MOT or checkpoint to look at individuals' needs in 3 areas. First, work, allowing you to work in the way that you need to, flexibly. The interesting statistic was shared that most over the 50s no longer have career conversations with their managers, but career path still really matters at that stage. 2, health and well-being. And 3, wealth, are individuals saving enough for retirement and healthcare. The other model we heard about is a new type of employment contract. This is something that allows you to be a permanent employee, but you can also work for other employers with your benefits protected, and interestingly also get a learning and training budget. This essentially creates a hybrid between full-time and gig workers. Finally, we spent some time exploring the potential impacts of the current coronavirus pandemic on the older workforce. Unsurprisingly, the panel all felt that at this point it's hard to call how the impacts of coronavirus are going to play out. Some scary but real examples were shared of employees feeling like they're not even feeling brave enough to look at how much their pension pots have declined at this point, but many are facing a reality that they're going to need to work for longer. The panel really felt that there'll be a need to pick up addressing the challenges of older workers with gusto as soon as countries return to work. All of the things we talked about are going to become all the more important to create an environment where those that want to work for longer can. This is getting more and more important by the day in the eyes of the panel. Concerns were raised that categorising the risk of returning to work by age is an unsophisticated approach for the long term. Underlying health conditions are a more important risk factor. Finally, all agreed that working from home type arrangements are going to remain in place for a while. Most companies are developing plans to return to workplaces, but very few are as yet ready, or indeed in many cases allowed to return to work as yet. That said, flexible working is definitely one potential benefit seen as coming out of the COVID-19 situation. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome everybody. I am delighted to have you here joining us today for our panel on capturing the value of an experienced workforce. I'm Amy Richards and I'm going to be moderating today's panel. By way of introduction, I'm a partner at Mercer, which is a large global consultancy focused on the health, wealth and career of the workforce. And I work there as part of our team, which explores the work-related implications of longevity. So I'm really excited to have the chance to be leading this panel today. I'm joined by our three panelists, Andy Briggs, Lesley Johnson and Placid Jover. And we're going to be talking around a few subjects related to longevity and how that plays out in the workplace. But just to kick things off, what I'd love to do is actually hand over to our panelists and have you all introduce yourselves and maybe share with our audience just a line or two on why making work work for the older workers is really important to you. So Andy, go ahead.
Hi there everyone, I'm Andy Briggs. I'm the Chief Executive of Phoenix Group, a FTSE 100 savings and retirement player. And also alongside that, I'm the government's business champion for the ageing society and for older workers. And the reason I got involved in all that, the reason I'm here today is, if you like, my day job is helping people to save more so they can enjoy a secure, healthy and prosperous retirement. Whereas the other dimension of that is to have an environment where people that choose to can work for longer as well. And those two combined will lead to the better retirement.
Fantastic, thank you. Lesley, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hello everyone, I'm Lesley Johnson. My day job is completely unrelated to longevity. I'm Director of Home Entertainment at BBC Studios, but I'm also the lead of our workplace network for older workers, and I sit on our Diversity and Inclusion Council. And I came at this really from my own personal experience as I got into my 50s, beginning to feel as if there was some sort of implicit ageism around at work, with a lot of things focusing on younger workers and nothing specifically in place for older workers.
I think that's your perspectives are going to be really interesting coming from that angle. Placid, how about yourself?
Yes, good morning from Buenos Aires. My name is Placid, and at the moment, I'm the head of HR for Unilever in LatAm. You were asking the question, why are we here? Yeah, why this topic? In my view, if we get work to work, the world works, right? And I think that the current moment that we are living with the whole corona situation is probably a nice testimony that when the world of work is broken, we as society suffer a lot, right? So that's probably my interest and my driver. Also important to say, probably in addition to my role, I'm also looking after new employment models on behalf of the HR team at Unilever.
I'm really pleased we've got such a diversity of people on today's panel. I think the different angles you're all going to come at these topics from are going to be really helpful for our audience to hear. So thank you for joining us today. The first thing we wanted to talk about a little bit was the various generations that we see in the workforce today and how we see those expectations of retirement, or indeed working beyond retirement, changing as you look across those generations. Perhaps I could go to you first, Andy, to talk a little bit about how you see that kind of thinking and shift in perspective impacting workers as they near retirement.
Sure. So I mean, I'd probably comment from a couple of perspectives. If I look at it from the perspective of the pension landscape, I view it as kind of three generations. The generations coming to the workforce now are all getting, or virtually all getting, auto-enrolled into their company pension scheme. And while over the longer term, an 8% contribution might not be enough, certainly be better placed than the middle generation I'll come to in a moment. So at least they're getting started early with pension savings. There's an older generation that have a good level of defined benefit pensions and also some defined contribution as well, and hence are fairly well catered for. But there's a kind of middle generation in the middle that missed out on defined benefit pensions as they started to disappear 20 odd years ago, and didn't get auto enrolment early enough in their careers. And so I think that there's a middle generation there that I would worry about. The other key observation I would make is the sort of the old norm of working to age 60 or even 65 or 60, and then being retired for say 10 years with a life expectancy of about 70. That just isn't the case anymore. Life expectancy at birth is sort of mid to high 80s, and therefore people could choose to retire at 60, but they're going to have a much lower level of retirement income to last them through to age 85 to 90. The alternative is to work for longer, but potentially a more flexible way. So that sort of sense of longevity, I think, is the other key factor we need to think about here.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear your perspectives, particularly on that middle generation that's getting lost in the mix here. Placid, I know when we were speaking before the beginning of today's discussion, you were talking a little bit about how you actually see some interesting differences in that around the world, and the importance to remember that this is not necessarily always the same picture from country to country. Perhaps you could share some of your thoughts on that with us.
Yeah, so probably, broadly speaking, I would say that the current system is under stress. And as Andy was saying, we have probably today more people aged 65 and above than we do aged 5 and below, which basically we have an inverted pyramid. We have probably more people taking out from the pot than we have people contributing to it. I think this is fair. It's a fair statement when you think about the developed economies, right? Europe, the US. But probably to your question, Amy, in a number of economies in the developing and emerging markets, a number of workers do not have access to pension or to savings. So the thought of retiring is simply not a paradigm that they are familiar with. Now, probably to your question, you were asking about expectations. I think that in my mind, there are four groups, right? People that want to retire and can retire. Yeah. So the expectation for this group of people is, hopefully, I will get to that retirement age and I will get what I'm entitled to. Then there's a second group, which is the ones that I'm calling the ones that can retire, but do not want to retire. Yes, simply because they just want to stay in the pitch for longer. And therefore, the expectation for the second group, with my head of HR, with my head as head of HR, is what's the answer, what's the artifact, what's the solution to keep these people employed for longer? Seems an obvious question to ask, but there isn't a straight answer to this. Then there is a third group, who are the people that probably would like to retire, but can't, because they can't financially sustain themselves. And I think that the expectation for this group is, what do I do with my skill set so that it doesn't become obsolete? So the expectation is, look after me and help me stay in the world of work. And then there is a fourth group, unfortunately, who are the ones that can't retire and probably not even thinking about retirement, because, as I say, it's a paradigm that it's unfamiliar to them.
I think that's really interesting. I think it's an important thread as we go through all of this to think about some of the global differences that we're seeing and how that plays out on the ground reality. One of the things that I thought would be interesting to follow up on, and I'd really love to get your perspectives on as we go through this discussion, is clearly we are in the midst of what many would say is an unprecedented change in society that the coronavirus and COVID-19 have driven. We've got huge shifts in a very short space of time in the workforce, and we've got what most of us believe will be a very significant economic impact coming out of that. I'd love to hear whether, in the light of that global downturn, you're starting to hear a change in perspectives around some of these topics, a change in urgency. Perhaps, Lesley, you could share some thoughts on that.
Well, obviously, we've not been in the office since March 16th, so it's quite hard of not, that sort of stuff and the banter that you get by being in the office. But I certainly know that at BBC, where we have exactly that mixed economy of a closed defined benefit scheme for some people, and actually the majority are in a defined contribution scheme. The concerns that have been flagged up to me is effectively, I don't even look to see how much has been knocked off the value of my pension pot. And that probably means I'm going to have to work longer, even if I did have a notional retirement age in mind. So this is really something that we've got to pick up with gusto when we can get back into our working group. And it makes what Placid just said then all the more important that we can develop and define ways of keeping older workers in the workforce if they want to or need to.
I can see some of you starting to react to some of those thoughts. And Andy, do you have further to add to that?
Yeah, indeed I do, and I mean I completely agree with what Lesley was just saying there. I think it really is imperative that employers think about how they encourage create an environment where those that want to work for longer are able to do so. I think it really is imperative, but there's some quite easy, straightforward steps that you can take, which I'm sure we'll cover as the conversation goes on. Just had a quick comment on one of the things that Placid said there, which is that, and obviously it's different in different countries, but many developed nations are in a similar place, that with the aging population, they have twice the number of people each year leaving the workforce, certainly this is true in the UK, through the aging population as are coming into the workforce through the education system. So I would argue that if businesses don't embrace more older workers, then they really are going to struggle to have the skills and capabilities they need because of that demographic. Now clearly, coronavirus and the long-term impacts of that will shift all of that, and it's quite hard to call how all that will play through. Hopefully we'll have the type of recession whereby there is a strong recovery, and although there's been a dip for a period of time, we do get back to high levels of employment quickly again. That remains to be seen.
Yeah, absolutely, and those sorts of statistics are terrifying in many ways, aren't they? Thanks so much for sharing your thoughts around how we're seeing this shift in attitudes. And I think throughout this conversation, as you say, there's a number of things that have been really brought into focus by the current economic downturn and all of the things that go around that. So as we go through this conversation, I'd love to hear more about what you're starting to see, because as you say, quite rightly, Andy, it's such early days at this point. Who knows how that's all going to play out. But I think it's a really important piece of the discussion right now. I'd like to turn a little bit to a slightly different flavour of this conversation, which is around diversity in the workforce. I find this a fascinating topic as we look at how ageism and age-related bias comes together with other forms of discrimination that we see. So in particular, for example, the gender perspective on age and so on. There's a lot of companies are trying to drive that dialogue much more actively now, and it's I think there's some really positive shoots of future hope out there, which is great. But again, I'd love to hear more about what you're either seeing in the companies you work in or the other working groups that you're part of. Let me actually start in a bit of a different order here. Just maybe Placid, we could go to you first of all and hear some of your thoughts there.
Sure. So probably my reaction would be along the lines of, I think we've all been putting a lot of effort behind gender diversity, which I think is right, and we should continue to drive this agenda really hard. But I think that there is more and more a need to dial up the conversation around some of the topics related to also diversity, right? Age, longevity being a beautiful example. Now, you are asking the question, how to start this, how to start a movement around longevity and age. And I would have actually 5 thoughts. I think number one is we need to get connected with our data. Do we understand in our companies the type of people that we have, the different segments in our population? That's probably point one. Also, getting connected with our data has a lens, and I think, Andy, you were referring to it, yeah? The silver generation, yeah, is the one that has the biggest, most significant purchasing power, so as consumers. And therefore, when you look at your own data as a company, the question is, does your workforce embody the consumer that you are trying to talk to. Yeah, so for me, there's something around understand your data and get connected to your data. Then there's something, point two, which is what we did back when I was the head of HR in the UK, get connected to your people. To me, it was eye-opening when we ran a number of focus groups with people from different age groups or segments, and really understand what's driving them, I had a couple of comments here that I thought worth sharing with you, right, coming from those focus groups. The insight coming out was, it seems that it all gravitates around millennials these days. So the older, most experienced generation at times feels left apart. Getting old, I'm quoting, you feel more vulnerable and less valuable. Or the fact that I'm not chasing a promotion now doesn't mean that I don't want to do good work and I wouldn't enjoy staying longer in my job, right? So I think there is something around really understanding what's the mood and the sentiment of this segment within your business. Then there is a third point, which is probably where we are in our journey, which is get the conversation started. Start talking about it, start measuring it, start building plans. They don't need to be perfect, which takes me probably to point number 4, which is review your internal infrastructure. Review your policies, your employment practices. One of the challenges, again, when I was in the UK, side of HR, that a number of employees made of me was, we need to stop looking at our policies, thinking of the family of 4 living in Surrey with a dog in a car. Yeah, there are other forms of diversity. So we need to start reviewing that infrastructure. And last point, number 5, Andy, I'm stealing from you an idea that you shared with us a moment ago. I think we need to put age as part of our talent chessboard. In a world where there will be scarcity of skills, we may be sitting on top of a gold mine that is yet to be discovered, nurtured, and developed instead of retired and put aside. Those would be the 5 things that I would have to share on this topic.
Oh, that's great. And I don't know, any reactions from the rest of you on those things?
Yeah, I'm happy to, Amy. So, I mean, I agree with all of those, and I think it's particularly good to hear the view of an HR director in embedding these into the workplace practice, because a lot of this is quite clear stuff. It just needs to be embraced by businesses, and the HR function businesses will have a key role to play. I guess the sort of build I would make is and I agree with Javier with Placid that the focus on gender is right and proper and a significant focus. But there's clear evidence that there is age discrimination as well, and that it interacts with other dimensions of diversity. So there's clear evidence that an older woman is more likely to be discriminated against than a younger woman. There's also clear evidence that an older black person is more likely to be discriminated against than a younger black person. And because currently employment tribunals don't allow for multiple discrimination causes in claims, that they tend to lead on gender because it is the aspect of diversity that historically has been most spoken about. So I don't want to underplay that. Gender discrimination and gender equality are really critical things to address, and it's understandable why we gender pay and so on. But I guess that the key point I would make is that the more I've worked in this space and this arena, the sorts of things that you need to do to address the challenges in one dimension of the D&I agenda are similar in others. So flexible working, adapting for carers, as 2 examples. If you get those policies right and then get them embedded through line managers in the organisation, they're going to help all aspects of diversity. So a lot of the things that organisations need to do will be common across the different dimensions of diversity.
Yeah, no, some great points there. And a little bit later in this, we're going to drill down a little bit into some of what all of your companies have been doing to think about how we can really change some of those workplace practices. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about that. Lesley, I know you've had some real experience of trying to drive the diversity agenda through the BBC's Diversity Council and so on. I'd love to hear a bit more about what you've seen there and experienced.
Well, I mean, when we started off, we're a relatively young, if you like, network. We only really kicked off our work about a year ago, and I joined the Diversity and Inclusion Council then. And I think one of the first things I said was, you know, in all of you around the table, whether you're looking at disability, social mobility, BAME, LGBTQ groups, if you're all lucky enough, you'll end up being old, and you'll end up being old and in work. So actually, you know, my group is the one that cuts across everyone, and the work that we do and the things that we hopefully achieve are going to be benefiting the other generations coming up through. So I think, you know, I was very much welcomed, and, you know, we listening to what our workshop said, there were key things there. Financial education, actually not advice, everyone knows that's regulated and you have to pay for it, but really starting early with helping all employees understand and do that thinking through about what sort of life they want, and, you know, in later life, and how, you know, and actually even those that are in mid-career, you know, have they actually saved enough now? Because it tends to be one of those things that people just put in the too hard to think about pot. Other things that, you know, we were looking at was that whole sense about being very, very vulnerable to redundancy, and the need to actually pull the data. We've just started on work now, unfortunately, across the whole diversity agenda. We're working with the consultancy firm to start and drill down into the, you know, the qualitative data as well as the quantitative data around the size and shape of the workforce, with the sort of intersectionality across the different groups. And I absolutely agree with what Andy says about policies. You know, actually a lot of the policies are there. They're just not written in the narrative that is addressed at older workers. So when you look at flexible working policy, the language tends to be very pivoted around working, you know, working families or, you know, parents of young children. But equally, that policy sits there. It equally works for an older worker who might be having to care for an elderly parent. So some of the things are there. They've just not been focused through the lens of an older workforce. And then some other things need putting in place. So we're working on a menopause policy to actually get some training in place, get the M word talked about, so men as well as women, young women as well as young men, all understand what this stage of life that every woman goes through is about. And, you know, we can bust the taboo and start talking about it properly and have the conversation. So, I mean, I don't know if, you know, I know we're going to talk about midlife MOT at some point, so I'll let others introduce that subject.
We absolutely are. And while we're on this topic, though, around diversity, one thing I'd really be interested to hear from you around is how you've been able, if indeed you have been able, to engage some of the younger generation in this topic, because that's one of the very interesting things about age-related discrimination is, as you say, if we're all lucky enough, we will all become older at some point. But it's a hard thing to grapple with for a lot of people until they've had that experience. So I'd really be interested to hear about how you're thinking through that.
Maybe I'll just add a comment there, Amy. So for me, actually, as I take this topic into my business, I very much talk about the benefits of a multi-generational workforce, because it seems to me at the core, I passionately believe inclusive and diverse businesses are better businesses. They make better decisions from a broad range of perspectives. They better represent their customer bases, better represent their communities. And I think Placid's point about, you know, over 50% of consumer spending is done by over 50-year-olds, so you kind of need some over 50s. But it is about multi-generational. The best research I've seen on this is McDonald's, that had a very conscious plan to have multi-generational workforces, and particularly to embrace older workers and over 50s, over 60s in their workforce. And they have very strong evidence that that both colleague engagement and customer satisfaction in the restaurants that were multi-generational was far higher than it was in restaurants that weren't multi-generational. So that's the key point I would make. And then you are involving the younger and the older together, and they're all learning from each other and create a better working environment as a result.
Interesting, very interesting.
If you don't mind, Amy, just a quick thought also based on a comment that Lesley made talking about financial education, right? I think probably financial education is a nice hook to get the whole thing started as well. I think it's a really nice hook. Doesn't matter if you are and if you have 20 or 30 years and you're looking to buy a house. I think it's a topic, finances, that in principle interest everyone. But I also wanted to make a link with mental health and well-being. Yeah, because I think the whole system is connected, right? You talk about age, you talk about financial education, but also we know that one of the big drivers for people in mental health and well-being has to do our personal worry with finances, right, and our financial situation. So I think if we are clever, there are 2 or 3 levers that could have a number of very positive collaterals in the way that we drive this agenda. Sorry, it's a thought that just came on the back of Lesley's comment talking about financial education. Yeah,
absolutely. No, I think it makes a lot of sense. And again, something that's probably been put into stark reality for a lot of people more recently as well. This is another area where I think the current economic pressures we're seeing, but also the workplace pressures that intersect with that, are driving some different behaviors and some new thinking, either good or bad. At the moment, we're seeing, I think, probably data that is pretty clear at the moment that the older generations are more severely impacted by COVID-19. And as a result, often the guidance around how individuals return to work and so on is being segmented by age. I wonder if any of you have got any perspectives on what you're starting to see there and how you think that might have some impacts in this space. Andy, I think you did.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit concerned about this, and I'm not being critical at all. When we were faced with the pandemic, a broad brush approach of saying over 70s are more at risk was a very, very sensible thing for the government to have done. So I wouldn't be critical at all. You needed something simple and straightforward. But there's going to be a much longer term playthrough of this. And the evidence that I've seen suggests that by far the most important factor is whether or not people have underlying health conditions and not age. And while there is a case that older people are more likely to have underlying health conditions than younger people, it needs to be an awful lot more sophisticated than saying, if you're over 70 or over 60, certain things apply. Absolutely the right thing to do in the early stages of this needs to be much more sophisticated going forward. I mean, over a third of over 70s have no underlying health conditions. So straight away, that they are much less susceptible, whereas 50% of people in their early 60s will have one related underlying health issue. So we can't just go with a blanket age around this. I mean, the other area that I found particularly harrowing as I watch the news every night. I wouldn't normally watch the news every night. I have done in recent weeks. Is just the situation in care homes, and I do think that's something we really need to focus in on. So not directly related to the workforce. Most people obviously in care homes aren't working, but I think I do feel that perhaps that hasn't had the focus that it should have done, and it's an area we need to focus in on going forward.
And absolutely related to progression of life and lifestyle over time. So I agree. I think it becomes very relevant. What about the other two of you? Are you also starting to hear some of the discussion around how we might think about the post-pandemic, or at least post this wave of it, types of reactions here?
At the moment, within BBC, we're just taking baby steps to look at how people will return to work, and it's very, very much focused on people who are broadcast critical, those people in operations and technology, and who are actually putting programs to air, news and what have you. So the signalling we're getting at the moment is that unless your job is essential and broadcast critical, you work from home, and I don't see that changing anytime soon, to be honest. Which is, raising the issue about mental health earlier, actually is it's going to be quite a significant difficulty for a lot of people. But I welcome the fact that my employer has been particularly supportive and very good in this, and the communication right from Tony Hall from the top has been good from the start. But yes, plans are being put in place, but not implemented as yet.
Right. Early days on this. Placid?
Same in our case. Nothing to add, Amy. Same in our case. Just monitoring, sensing, checking, developing plans, but not yet ready.
Okay. Be interesting to see how that plays out for the older segment of the population over time. Let's move on a little bit from that to talk about some of the new sorts of employment and working models that I think all of you are exploring in various ways. I think our audience should find this particularly interesting as we think about what you can actually do in a concrete fashion. Lesley was trailing the concept of the mid-career check-in earlier on, and I'd be really keen to hear more about what you're doing there. I think maybe, Andy, I think you've had experience of doing this in anger, and your company's a little further down the road. And then I know some of the rest of you as well. So let's start there and hear more about it.
Yes. Sorry, go on, Lesley. You go. Go for it.
I wasn't quite sure who was going first there. So yes, I mean, the reality is that there is a connection between Andy's midlife MOT and ours at the BBC, because our defined contribution provider is Aviva, who've trialled this internally with their workforce. And we've picked up on that notion and are developing that programme for BBC right the way across the board. We were due, sadly, on the 30th of April to be running a pilot in our offices. And, you know, that midlife MOT is around those three planks of your work. What is your work allowing you to work in the way you need to? Are you being given the flexibility? Are policies there for you? It's about your well-being, and you know, are you looking after your health, and a whole section of offer around that, which you know we're pulling together within BBC and together as part of that program. And then the third piece is about your wealth, and are you saving enough? Are you putting away enough now at the age of 40, 45 or 50 in order to be able to afford your later life? So as I say, the pilot had been due to run on April the 30th. It'll now get pushed to later on in the year. And I'm very much looking forward to supporting and rolling that out.
Fantastic. Now, for the benefit of our non-British audience, I should probably get you just to tell everybody what an MOT actually is originally.
Well, it's when a car is more than 3 years old in the UK, you have to have a check in to make sure that it's safe to keep being on the road.
Excellent, thank you. I have to admit, even I've lived outside of the UK for a very long time, and I couldn't actually remember what the initial standard stood for. So it's important. Andy, you I think also had experience of this sort of midlife check-in approach. So perhaps you could share some of your experiences there.
Yeah, I mean, and very similar to what Lesley's just covered there. So my former employer, Aviva, we pioneered this, working closely with the Department for Work and Pensions, exactly as Lesley has said. You know, three parts to it: sort of the financial well-being, the health, both mental and physical health and well-being, but also the kind of career element, which I think is important, because we tended to target at 45, 50-year-olds. And basically part of the pitch is you're probably going to be working for another 15 to 20 years. What do you want to do with the next 15 to 20 years of your career? Lots of people's mindset is, I'll carry on doing what I've always done. Well, and that might well work for some people, but others can do something very different for that next 15 to 20 years. And what we found is that over 50s were far less likely to have a career development conversation with their line manager than under 50s were, and we weren't happy about that. You know, the desire to develop and grow should be there for everyone, not just the younger age group. We were getting a 98% take-up rate of people that we invited to go to the midlife MOTs, were going along to the sessions, and the feedback could not have been more positive. So really valuable across those three elements. I mean, the other area I wouldn't mind just expanding around, you know, and there's a kind of suite of things I think that are important for, you know, employers to focus on. You know, we've already talked a bit about celebrating the positives of intergenerational workforces. Flexible working is really critical, not only having the policy, but also embedding that through leaders. And I think this will be one of the positives that we can take out of this coronavirus scenario and situation is we have all learned to work from home, work more flexibly and travel less. You know, I mean, I'm doing personally 11 and a half hour days, but then I'm finishing at 6:30 and I'm out in the garden with our two boys playing. I never normally do that at home. I'm getting a flight back from Edinburgh, or I'm going out for a dinner. And so I think that's all important areas, inclusive recruitment as well. The one I just wanted to hone in on, though, was around carers leave, because 1 in 5 over 50s have caring responsibilities for an elderly relative, and it's typically 1 in 4 women, 1 in 8 men. And the analogy I always draw, Amy, is that if an organisation said to a pregnant woman that you can have the day off to have the baby as long as you're in the day before and the day after, we'd all be quite horrified about that. And yet that's effectively what a lot of organisations end up saying to their typically over 50-year-olds who have responsibility for an equally dependent human being. It just happens to be an elderly relative rather than younger. And incidentally, in this COVID-19 situation, 100% of people with caring responsibilities are saying they're finding it much tougher. In a recent survey Business of the Community did, 100% saying they're finding it much tougher. So how we support carers with carers leave, I think, is really critical.
I'm glad you picked up on that, because I think to your point of the suite of initiatives that you need to put in place in order to be able to create a solution that works for everybody, it's not one size fits all. I think it's a really important point to be highlighting. Placid, I know as well you've been doing some really interesting work around this as well. So I'd love to hear about how you're thinking about the employment model in this situation.
So, and again, probably taking it from where Andy left things, right? I guess it all starts by trying to, how do we help people depending on where is it that they are when it comes to their work and life. Some of them may need time to care for older parents. Some others may just be at that point in their career where they want to start building that portfolio of jobs or work. Some other people may want to start giving time back and help others. Some may just want to probably go back to uni and study or do something else, right? So, but the point is, that's probably what we're trying to solve for. How do we help people to learn, earn, work, and live differently, right? That's the problem that we were solving. And how do we do that? Trying to challenge the current paradigm being you are either a full-time equivalent working exclusively for the same company in exchange for a salary, benefits, etc., but also challenging the whole world of the gig economy, contractors and freelancers, right? So we wanted to do something new. So the answer basically that we've come up with, and we are piloting it at the moment in the UK, we've created a new type of employment contract. And this new type of employment contract allows you to be a permanent employee of Unilever, but you can work for other employers. You're only asked to work for a certain period of time for us, for which you get paid. Your service is protected. You also get benefits protection, like pension, medical, and so on, and you get an amazing learning budget, among other things. So we've basically created a hybrid between, so to say, a full-time equivalent and the whole contractor world. We just try to fill that white space, so to say, again, with the purpose of helping those who want to work, learn, earn, and live differently, but always with the support, the power, and the care of having Unilever behind them for as long as they want it. I'm going to pause. Back to you.
I think that is a superb and really interesting model that you've been building, and I love how you've been running towards that white space. I think someone else, Lesley, were you going to jump in on that point as well?
I'd just say I really would like to, learn more about how that is being put together, because exactly to what Andy was saying earlier as well, that it's flexibility, it's the ability to work how you want to work and to potentially combine your existing role with other things that you might want to do in life is really important for the financial and mental well-being. And at the moment, in the organisation that I work for, we just have those very rigid part-time contract or full-time contract, full-time permanent employment, and nothing that really sits in between. and be very interested to follow the development of Unilever's work there.
Well, thank you so much. I think probably we've reached the end of the time we have together as a group today. Some of these points at the end here around how this and dealing with the older workforce is really an increasing source of competitive advantage, I think will have been really valuable for our audience. So thank you all very much for all of your thoughts and for sharing those so generously with everybody today.